morning, Mr. Chisholm.
Good morning.
You can see me then, can you, and hear me?
I can see and hear you, thank you.
Good. Well, that's a good start. Now, you're talking here from Edinburgh, are you?
From Edinburgh, yes.
And you're in an office there?
I'm in Brodie's in Edinburgh.
In Brodie's, right. And who is there with you?
Nobody's in the room with me.
Well, that's also entirely common. You're talking here to a room in which there are a number of people. They're core participants and members of the public and lawyers. Many are from Scotland and particularly interested to hear what you have to say, and will be all the more interested because, of course, as you will know, today is World Hepatitis Day, and much of your evidence concerns hepatitis and the reaction of the Scottish Government to that. In a moment or two, Mary will ask you to take the affirmation, but first let me tell you that you're not only talking to the audience here, but beyond this room, to those who will be watching on YouTube or live stream, and they are likely to number in 3 figures. So that's your audience. Ms. Scott will be asking you the questions in a moment or two, but first Mary.
Please state your full name.
Malcolm George Richardson Chisholm.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Ms. Scott.
Good morning, Mr. Chisholm. Can you see and hear me?
Good morning. I can.
I'm going to start with a brief overview of your career. You trained as a teacher, and then in 1992 you were elected as the Labour MP for Leith, which subsequently became North Edinburgh and Leith. Is that right?
That's correct, thank you.
And as the MP for Leith, you sat as an MP in Westminster.
I did indeed.
In May 1997, you were appointed the Scottish Office Minister for Local Government, Housing and Transport in the Blair government. Is that right?
That is true.
And at that time, the Secretary of State for Scotland was Donald Dewar.
Indeed.
How many other ministers were there in the Scottish office at that time, can you recall?
I think there were 6 in total.
And is it right also that you resigned after just 6 months from that post, so in December 1997?
I would say 7 months, but that's more or less true.
Then in May 1999, you were elected the Scottish Member of Parliament for Edinburgh North and Leith, again, still as a member of the Labour Party.
That is correct.
And is it right to understand that you had your seat as a member of the Scottish Parliament and your seat as a member of Parliament in Whitehall for a period of time?
For 2 years, all the MPs that became MSPs overlapped for 2 years.
And how did that work in practice?
Well, in practice, I was in the Scottish Parliament most of the time. It was very difficult to go to Westminster, but I certainly went there. Particularly enjoyed going there in the summer recesses when, of course, the Scottish Parliament was in recess and Westminster wasn't.
In terms of the roles that you had in the Scottish Government, you were Deputy Convener of the Health and Community Care Committee from the start of the Parliament in May 1999 until October 2000. Is that right?
That's right, for 18 months, yes.
And then in October 2000, you became the Deputy Health and Community Care Minister, and at that time Susan Deacon was the Minister.
That's correct.
And that required you, did it, to stand down as a member of the Health and Community Care Committee?
Yes, you couldn't be a minister and on the committee.
And then your witness statement tells us that you also chaired the Care Development Group of the Implementation on Free Personal Care.
Yes, when I was Deputy Minister, I was very busy on social care issues, both that plus I was taking the regulation of care bill through the Parliament.
And then in November 2001, you were appointed by the then First Minister, Jack McConnell, as the Minister for Health and Community Care.
That's correct.
And you held that post until October 2004, when you were appointed the Minister for Communities.
That's also correct.
And then you returned to the backbenches in December 2006.
That's true.
And then you stood down as a member of the Scottish Parliament in March 2016.
That's correct.
And since that time, have you carried out any work of any kind that's relevant to the matters that this inquiry is concerned with?
Not relevant to this inquiry, no.
And were you asked to give evidence to Penrose?
No, I was not. No.
I'm just going to ask you some questions about your experience, both as a politician in Westminster and in Edinburgh. It's right to understand that while you were in government in Edinburgh and Scotland, there was a coalition government between Labour and Liberal Democrats. Is that right?
That's correct. Oh, yes.
And so the senior figures in the Scottish government during that time were the First Minister, first Donald Dewar, then Henry McLeish, and then Jack McConnell.
Jack McConnell, yes.
And they were all members of the Labour Party.
Yes, yes.
And then the Deputy First Minister, who was head of the Liberal Democrat Party, was Jim Wallace.
That's right.
Now, as a Minister for Health and Community Care, you were a member of the Scottish Cabinet. Is that right?
That's correct as well.
And your area of responsibility was for NHS, public health and community care in Scotland.
Indeed, yes.
And over the time that you were the minister, so over that 3-year period, you had 4 deputy ministers: Mary Mulligan, Hugh Henry, Frank McAveety, and Tom McCabe. Is that right?
That's correct as well.
And was the appointment of deputy ministers an appointment made by the First Minister?
Indeed, indeed.
And do you know why there was such a high turnover of deputy ministers during your 3-year period?
I think the first one, Hugh Henry, became a member of the Cabinet at a certain point when one of the other Cabinet ministers resigned, I think, anyway. So Hugh Henry became a member of the Cabinet. And there were always 2 deputies in the 2001-2003 period. So those 2 factors explain that. Whereas in the 2003-4 period, there was just 1 deputy, Tom McCabe.
So when you were a deputy yourself, were you deputy with another?
No, that was a new departure that Jack McConnell made in November 2001. Previously, there had only been 1 deputy. There were 2 deputies. He tried that between 2001 and 2003. And then from 2003, it reverted to 1 deputy again.
And so is it right to understand that there were, in total, during the period that you were, during 2002, 2001, 2003, 3 health ministers?
Between
three.
There was 2 deputies at any one time.
Yes.
But Hugh Henry became a minister and therefore had to be replaced by Frank McAveety.
But there were between 2 and 3 ministers responsible for health and community care in Scotland.
Yes, but as during the time of Susan Deakin, there was some division of responsibility, and particularly when I was minister, none of the deputies had very much to do with the issues that we're discussing today.
So when you were, during the time of Susan Deakin, how was responsibility divided up between the minister and the deputies?
As I said a minute ago, I had a very heavy responsibility for all matters to do with social care, which was particularly prominent at that time, both because of the legislation and because of the development of free personal care. But obviously I took a great interest in health issues, but clearly a lot of the decisions about health at that time were made by Susan Deakin when I was the deputy.
And so, in particular, in relation to decisions about blood and blood policy during Susan Deacon's time as Minister, was she primarily responsible for that?
Oh, indeed, yes. Yes.
And then moving on then to the time when you were Minister, how was responsibility for health and community care divided up between yourself and your deputies?
Well, for example, Hugh Henry had responsibility for social care, as I had when I was the deputy, and then when Frank McAveety took over from him, he had responsibility for social care as well. Mary Mulligan had overlapped with certain health issues, but again didn't have responsibility for anything to do with the matters that we're discussing today.
So it is right to understand, is it, that during your time as Minister, you were responsible for making decisions about blood and blood policy?
Indeed.
As a Deputy Minister, did you have a private office?
Oh yes, all deputy ministers have a private office.
And obviously you had a private office as a minister. What sort of how many staff did you have in your private office?
Well, if we look at the ministerial position, there was a private secretary, a deputy private secretary, and I think 2 other staff. When you were deputy, there would just be 1 private secretary and 1 other staff.
And were the officials in your private office drawn from civil servants who had been in place prior to devolution?
I think that was the case. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was the case.
And in terms of the officials who work for the Department of Health and Community Care, were they, again, drawn from those officials who had worked for the Scottish Home and Health Department prior to devolution?
Well, I imagine a lot of them were. What proportion were, I wouldn't be able to say.
You had experience, presumably, of working with officials when they were part of the Scottish office pre-devolution, and then working with officials post-devolution in your ministerial roles. Was there any discernible difference between the way that the civil service was run or managed, or the way it interacted with ministers pre and post-devolution?
Not in principle. I mean, the main difference that arose after devolution was that there was far more transparency, far more accountability, far more discussion of the issues that were the responsibility of the Scottish Parliament, which in many cases had been similar to the responsibilities of the Scottish office, but clearly there was far more discussion and scrutiny of them. So that obviously had an effect on civil servants as well as ministers. But in principle, the relationship was the same.
And we see in the documents reference to the healthcare policy division on documents concerned with blood policy. Was that the relevant division responsible for blood policy?
And indeed.
And can you recall how many officials were working in that division?
Well, there were a very large number of officials, but the ones that were responsible for sending me advice on blood policy, whereas stated in my written statement, I think I mentioned 6 or 7 in my written statement near the beginning.
So the names that we've come across are Christine Dora, Bob Stock, Sandra Faulkner, and Linda Towers, who I understand is a solicitor.
I think they were the ones. I think that was probably from Susan Deacon's list. I gave senior civil servants Ian Gordon, Geoffrey Gobson, and of course Dr. Aileen Keel. Not Christine Dora or Linda Towers particularly, although I think Linda Towers was still around, but I don't recall getting much from her in relation to that. It was the ones that I listed in my statement near the beginning.
And what was your understanding of the role of the Chief Medical Officer and the medical advisors when it came to...
I think that's an interesting point, because the relationship between ministers and the Chief Medical Officer is slightly different from the relationship between a minister and civil servants. And in a kind of way we've seen that play out recently in relation to COVID, because I think the Chief Medical Officer has a more of an independent status, and therefore would have more freedom to make certain decisions in the specifically medical area, whereas all decisions or all advice that civil servants gave was ultimately challengeable and could be overruled by ministers. But there's a certain difference there, I think, which you only appreciate once you've been a health minister.
So, right to understand then from that the role of the medical advisors was to advise ministers who would then themselves be taking decisions about policy.
Well, clearly policy decisions, they tended to come from the civil servants, but medical officers would obviously sometimes come to politicians and say, do you approve this, do you approve that? But the point I'm making is certain decisions, I think some of them will come up later when we're discussing variant CJD, some of the decisions that were purely medical would not be for politicians to take. And so that's the distinction I'm making, and that in that sense, medical officers in certain areas have more freedom to act on their own.
And in relation to those issues that are, as you say, purely medical, the line of accountability from the medical officers would be through the Chief Medical Officer, would it?
Oh, in terms of other medical officers, yes.
And so the Chief Medical Officer had some responsibility for policy where it was, as you say, purely medical.
Yes, I mean, that might have been quite a narrow area. I'm just stating that in principle, so we'd have to look at specific issues. I think, as I said, it may come up in relation to our discussions later on variant CJD.
How frequently would you meet with the CMO as minister?
Well, certainly I would meet with the CMO or the deputy CNO. It's hard to say how often, but not every day, but reasonably regularly.
So there wasn't a scheduled weekly, monthly meeting program of meetings.
No.
So it was as and when required.
As and when for particular issues.
And in terms of the officials on the medical side who had a particular input into blood policy, was that Dr. Keel?
Dr. Keel would be the leader on that. That's why I named her in terms of the senior civil servants involved.
And how frequently would you meet with officials working in the health policy division?
Oh, well, frequently. I suppose that's another difference between the before devolution and after, because you were in the same building as officials all the time, whereas in the UK Parliament, clearly you were in London a lot of the time and the officials weren't on hand. So in that sense, you would meet officials more regularly in the Scottish Parliament context than previously.
And was there a regular programme of meeting when you were ministers with senior officials in the department?
It would be as and when on particular issues. Meetings would be called on particular topics. It wouldn't be a regular every Monday morning kind of thing.
What level of liaison was there between you and the Secretary of State for Scotland during your time as Minister for Health and Community Care?
No, not a great deal. I mean, there was some, obviously, and some of the issues we're going to discuss in terms of resolving the devolved powers and the social security issues for the ex gratia payments. But apart from that, there would not be regular contact, no.
So you wouldn't consult the Secretary of State for Scotland on health policy as a fellow Labour politician, albeit in the Westminster government?
No. I mean, no, I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding of that. I think free personal care is obviously the best example of that, where we were quite prepared to go down a route which was not really acceptable to the UK government. So health policy was indeed devolved.
And the same question in relation to the Department of Health ministers. As a matter of generality, what level of liaison was there between you and the health ministers at Westminster?
Well, as I said in my written statement, I had occasional meetings with them. I mean, I happen to have been a Westminster colleague of both Alan Milburn and John Reid, but it was very much an occasional meeting. If I was down in London for some other purpose, then I would possibly have a meeting with them. But it was not a regular occurrence, and clearly we'd gone our different ways on several aspects of health policy, not just on free personal care.
And I think you tell us in your statement that you had annual meetings with the 4 health ministers.
Yes, we used to have, I don't know if they were strictly annual, but certainly regular, about annual, I suppose that would be right, with the Welsh and the Northern Ireland health ministers as well.
Now, was there an expectation, given that there were Labour governments in both Westminster and in Holyrood, that there should be information sharing on devolved issues such as health?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that there was an expectation that that there would be information sharing, but obviously that's a different matter than from having to follow the policies that were being adopted in London. I mean, I think it's fairly well known, for example, that the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, was quite critical of the kind of health policies in general that we were pursuing in Scotland, but that was not a problem. That was the whole nature of devolution.
Again, speaking generally, what kind of liaison did you have as Minister for Health with the Treasury in London?
Well, I had no direct relation with the Treasury in London.
And how did the funding of your department operate during your time as Minister?
Well, the money is saved now. In fact, the money is allocated basically in accordance with the Barnett formula, and then it is up to the Scottish Government to decide how that money is distributed to the various departments in the Scottish Government. And, well, it's the same today as it was then, except there's obviously a bit more freedom in relation to tax policy in Scotland now, but it's the same in principle, that the money just comes as a block, and it's up to the Scottish Government to decide how it's allocated to different departments.
So who did you have a relationship with in the Scottish Government in terms of trying to get your budget?
The Finance Secretary, when I was Health Minister, was Andy Kerr, who happened to take over from me as Health Secretary, but Health Minister, but he was the Finance Minister during my time as Health Minister.
So it was to him that you were making your bids for your budget and so on?
Indeed, yeah.
Just looking at the arrangements for the civil service, was there any kind of division between those civil servants who were working for the Scottish Executive and those who were working for the Scotland office after devolution?
Oh, but yeah, they were completely different civil servants. There was no overlap there at all. There were no Scotland office civil servants in St Andrew's House or other Scottish executive buildings. They would have their own department, and they were completely different.
Is it right to understand that the management of the civil service in Scotland, so those civil servants working for the Scottish Executive, lay in London?
Well, I think that's still true to this day. I think the Scottish Government civil servant is formally part of the UK Government civil service, but that doesn't mean that they don't serve the Scottish Government of today or the Scottish Executive in our day.
And did that fact that they're part of the same civil service cause any problems or any tensions during your time as Minister?
I don't think so, no.
What kind of well, you may not know the answer to this, but do you know what kind of liaison there was between those civil servants working for the Scottish Executive and those working for the Scotland office?
Well, I don't know, but I imagine they had conversations.
And equally, do you know the kinds of levels of liaison between those civil servants working for the Scottish Executive on health and the civil servants in London working for the Department of Health?
I don't know. I wouldn't imagine there was a great deal, but there might have been on specific issues.
Did you have a hope or an expectation that politics in Scotland post-devolution would be done differently from politics in London?
Well, indeed. I mean, I was very excited almost about the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, partly obviously because all those areas of policy that had been under the old Scottish office were going to be discussed a whole lot more and with a great deal more transparency. But I also was very optimistic about the nature of the Scottish Parliament and hoped that it might be different in some ways from the UK Parliament. Much as I like the UK Parliament, I thought particularly the committee system in the Scottish Parliament would be more powerful. I think that it was set up to be that way. And I think there was a group called the Consultative Steering Group, which made the standing orders for the new Scottish Parliament. And they had a very optimistic vision of a more consensual partnership approach to politics in Scotland. I don't think the consensual has taken place, or possibly even the partnership. But it's certainly true that the committees had a more central role. And obviously that is part of the story of what we're discussing today as well.
And the committee system and the central role you're describing, is that primarily a role in holding the government to account, i.e. scrutinising, questioning, probing government policy?
Well, I think that's true. I mean, it has advantages and disadvantages because the Scottish Parliament has unitary committees, whereas Westminster has separate committees for the scrutiny and legislation. Select committees on the one hand and bill committees on the other, whereas in the Scottish Parliament, the committee, for example, for health and community care, as it then was, would have responsibility for anything to do with health and community care, whether it was legislation or policy or anything. So I think they were very much more involved with health policy, but also the intention of the Scottish Parliament was there should be more partnership between the government, as it were, and the committees. And I think that there was some evidence of that, certainly in the early days. There is some criticism now that committees tend to just follow government policy more in Scotland, but certainly in those days, whenever I was a minister, for example, when I took legislation into the Scottish Parliament, I had to work very hard to persuade the committee to, accept particular policies, and sometimes I might have to make an amendment. Whereas in the Westminster Bill committees, legislation is never really changed because the government has a majority and everything gets through. So I think in principle, the committees of the Scottish Parliament are a good model, and I think it worked very well, certainly in the early days.
And what power did committees have if they disagreed with a policy? What power did they have?
Well, they obviously could vote down legislation, or they could issue reports which were critical of the government, and they could obviously bring motions to Parliament if they wanted to.
We're going to look later on today at some of the proceedings, some of the hearings in the Health and Community Care Committee, and indeed at one of their reports. So it's right to understand, is it that they could have hearings, they could call evidence, they could publish reports and so on?
Indeed, they actually combined the role of the Westminster Select Committees and the Westminster Bill Committees in one committee.
Now, the focus of many of the questions this morning are going to be on whether or not there should have been a financial scheme for those who were infected with hepatitis C from blood and blood products, and also on the question of whether or not there should have been a calls for a public inquiry. Both of those issues, as I understand it, had come before the Scottish Parliament via petitions from the members of the public. Can you explain to us the petition process?
Yes, well, that was another. I mean, I think there are petitions at Westminster, but I don't think very much happens with them, whereas there was actually a petitions committee in the Scottish Parliament, and when petitions were brought to the petitions committee, they could decide what to do with them, but quite frequently they referred them to the subject committee. So the two petitions relating to the subject we're discussing were sent to the Health Committee in the early days of the Parliament. I think one related to the issue of a public inquiry and one related to the issue of compensation. So in a sense, two of our central issues. And the Health Committee then had to decide what to do with those petitions. And as I said in my written statement, in the days when I was on the Health Committee, there was really very little discussion of those petitions because the committee made the decision to leave detailed consideration of those petitions until the report which Susan Deakin had commissioned into the heat treatment of blood products in the period 1985 to 1987 had been completed. So that was the position of the Health Committee in the time that I was on it, but clearly once I had left it and Susan Deakin's report had been dealt with by the committee, they then went on to take a great deal more evidence, including from the Scottish Blood Transfusion Service and Haemophilia Scotland, and they produced a report, I suppose, about a year after I had left the committee.
And the committee was a cross-party committee, was it?
It was indeed a cross-party committee, yes.
And was it? How was it viewed by yourself and your ministerial colleagues? Was it viewed as a powerful committee, a committee reflecting public opinion or cross-party opinion?
Well, it was a powerful committee, and the reality is there were a lot of very independent-minded people on it, and also a lot of people who knew a great deal about health. I mean, to take two examples from my own party, John McCallion was on it, who was always a very independent-minded MP in his day and then MSP, but also Dr. Richard Simpson, who was a highly regarded, highly respected former GP. And so there was a great deal of health knowledge and independent mindedness, as it were, on the committee. But on the other side, to be fair and balanced, there was Nicola Sturgeon, for example, who's obviously well known nowadays as First Minister. So it was a very impressive committee, absolutely.
I'm going to turn now to ask some questions about the issue of a compensation scheme or payment scheme for those infected with hepatitis C from infected blood and blood products. Now, you were appointed Deputy Minister for Health and Community Care just after, is this right, the internal investigation that you've mentioned that Susan Deakin commissioned was published? Indeed, in October 2000. October 2000. And just to be clear, we have Susan Deakin coming to give evidence tomorrow, so I'm going to be asking her questions about that report. But was there a sense when you were coming into your post that that question of whether or not there should be a compensation or payment scheme had effectively been dealt with and put to bed by the report and by the Scottish Executive's conclusions that there'd been no negligence on the part of the SNBTS and so therefore there would be no compensation paid? Well, but I don't think it had been put to bed because we knew that the Health Committee was going to pursue its inquiry now, so I don't think anybody thought that the issue was put to bed by that. No, I don't think so. I'm going to pick up matters in October 2001, so just shortly before you become Minister, with the report published by the Health and Community Care Committee, which we find at MACK 301929_001. So that we can see as the heading of the report, 17th report, 2001 report on hepatitis C. And if we can just go, please, to page 9, we can see the point we've just been discussing. The committee's involvement at paragraph 6. The Health and Community Care Committee's direct involvement in this issue arises from 2 petitions referred to us by the Public Petitions Committee, and then it sets out the detail of those two those two petitions. If we could then turn, please, the committee then sets out the background, including the handing down of the judgment by Mr Justice Burton in the A and others hepatitis C litigation, which I'll come on to ask you questions about it later on today. And then if we turn then please to page 13, we can see the main areas for consideration. And it says this: we found that consideration of the issues raised by the two petitions resolved into three main questions. Firstly, there was the question of whether, on the basis of the evidence currently in the public domain, the SMBTS or any other body within the healthcare system could be held to have been at fault in allowing some individuals to become exposed to hepatitis C contaminated blood. Secondly, we had to consider the call from the Haemophilia Society and others for an independent inquiry into all the relevant circumstances surrounding the entry of contaminated blood into the healthcare system. And finally, there was the question whether, even if negligence could not be ascribed to any relevant body, it would be appropriate to award some form of financial or other assistance, whether described as compensation or not, to help hepatitis C sufferers infected through NHS treatment to deal with the consequences of their illness. And it's in relation to that last question that I'm going to ask you questions. The committee deal with the first and second questions. I'll just go to those very briefly for completeness. We can see what they say about the negligence question if we go down the page. They say, arguably, there was no need for us to consider the first question because it had already been answered. The executive's inquiry exonerated the SMBTS of negligence and also concluded there was no evidence that haemophilia centre directors had failed to give adequate advice on blood transfusion risk to patients. And it's there, that's a reference there to the report that you mentioned from October 2000, is it?
Indeed.
And then the committee go on to point out that the Haemophilia Society have been critical of that report. And so in paragraph 27, we see that they gave the opportunity for further evidence. And then we can see the conclusions are at 17, page 17, on the use of the ALT test. The limited evidence the committee considered makes it difficult to reach a definitive conclusion, but saying at 44, paragraph 44, we were largely persuaded by the case put by the SMBTS that the decision not to use the ALT test was predominantly a clinical one, and we acknowledge there appear to have been a number of important reasons for not using the test. Not least amongst those was the risk of running out of blood supplies needed for the essential medical treatment. It does not appear to us that the decision not to use the test could be described in hindsight as unjustifiable or unreasonable. And then the second issue on negligence they looked at was unnecessary delay by the SMBTS, and that's set out at paragraph 46. The allegation and the conclusions we can see at page 19. Paragraph 53, conclusions unnecessary delay. On the basis of the limited evidence we considered, we could take only a provisional view. This was that there was no evidence of negligent delay on the part of the SMBTS. It was not clear that given the level of scientific knowledge at the time that the SMBTS should have acted differently. And then it goes on to consider the failure to inform patients fully of the risks involved. And we can see what they say at paragraph 56. On this matter, there appears to be a clear difference of opinion between the findings in the executive's report and the personal testimony of witnesses from the Haemophilia Society. And then if we go over to page 20, the conclusion at paragraph 66 appears this apparent failure of some clinicians to disclose treatment risks openly to some haemophiliacs might, we think, be partially mitigated by the apparent lack of awareness of the potential seriousnesses of the NANBH virus at the time. More importantly, medical practitioners would have been aware that alternative treatments for treatments of bleeding, such as cryoprecipitate, or the option of simply not treating uncontrolled bleeding, would themselves have carried serious health risks. This would clearly have influenced the advice clinicians gave their patients. And they then go on to look at the second issue, should there be an independent inquiry? And the conclusion that they reach in relation to that is that they don't support an independent inquiry. And then if we come on to page 23, we can see what they said about the third issue, the HCV hepatitis C compensation or payment scheme. Targeted financial and other assistance regardless of negligence. The more that we as a committee have investigated the issue raised in the two petitions, the more our conviction has grown that what lies behind both is a fundamental question of fairness and consistency. The individuals who petitioned us contracted a serious and incurable virus many years ago as a result of medical treatment, or are relatives of those people. Understandably, they feel wronged and have campaigned over many years for recognition and redress. To these individuals, the relatively narrow question of whether or not any particular agency or individual within the NHS has been legally negligent, whilst important and worthy of exploration, is of secondary importance. What they consider more important is that the executive recognise what they would classify as the moral case for providing support, and that it provides the concrete practical assistance that they consider would be fair and appropriate. The Scottish Executive has consistently referred to the principle that governments pay out compensation only when they or their agencies have been demonstrably negligent as justification for their current policy. There are, however, instances of exceptions to this principle, including some in the medical sphere in which individuals can claim damages or other financial assistance without having to prove fault. One example is the Consumer Protection Act 1987. And so was it your understanding that they're there referring to the decision of Mr. Justice Burton in the A and others case?
Yeah, indeed.
And then if we go down to paragraph 86, they give the further example of that as being the Macfarlane Trust. And then at paragraph 87, they say this, that individuals who contract one type of virus through contaminated blood transfusions should have recourse to financial assistance on a no-fault basis, while those infected in the same way with another virus do not, is for the Haemophilia Society illogical and unfair. And if we then go over the page, please, at paragraph 89, as we have already said, the Executive's recent decision to settle with all of those individuals intending to bring an application under the Consumer Protection Act 1987 is welcome. If anything, however, it merely creates a new inconsistency. Now, as we understand it, anyone infected after the 1st of March 1988, when the Act came into force, who has instructed a lawyer will be entitled to financial assistance from the Executive, while anyone infected before this arbitrary date or who was infected afterwards but who has not instructed a lawyer will not. In our view, this only goes to undermine the need for a consistent and principled approach. And just to pausing there, just to reiterate what I said earlier, I'll come back and ask you some questions in relation to that issue later on today. And then at paragraph 90, having considered the issues raised in the petitions, the committee has become persuaded by what we classified as the moral case for providing financial assistance to those individuals infected with hepatitis C through the blood transfusions. It's important that we make one matter clear, however. The Minister for Health and Community Care has expressed concern about establishing any principle of awarding compensation for harm caused by NHS treatment simply because the treatment carried a risk and that risk subsequently crystallised as an injury. We are in full agreement with the Minister on this matter. And then going down to paragraph 91, the committee therefore wishes to stress the narrowness of the view to which it has come, We are not advocating the principle that all injury caused through NHS treatment should be compensated, nor are we asking the executive to establish any new wide-ranging precedent on the management of risk in clinical decision-making. Instead, we simply seek to correct an inconsistency in the operation of an already created and narrow precedent, namely the precedent created when the Macfarlane Trust was set up. We do not envisage that any ad hoc design to provide financial or other help to individuals infected with hepatitis C through NHS treatment would necessarily require the NHS to change any of its current medical policies and practices on a risk arising from treatment. And then if we go, I think we can then pick it up to page 26. Paragraph 98, we have come to the view that financial and other practical assistance awarded on a no-fault basis is the clearest solution to the issues raised in these petitions. We believe, as a matter of fairness, that individuals who have suffered serious long-term harm as a result of NHS treatment should receive some practical assistance. We also believe that this solution is required for reasons of consistency in recognition of the fact that HIV sufferers already receive assistance under clearly analogous circumstances via the Macfarlane Trust. And then we can see the recommendations made following on from that analysis at the bottom of the page. First one, we recommend that the executive set up a mechanism for providing financial and other appropriate practical support to all hepatitis C sufferers who have contracted the virus as a result of blood transfusions provided by the NHS in Scotland, or which involve blood or blood products produced by the SMBTS. That support should be available to all such hepatitis C sufferers, whether they are haemophiliacs or non-haemophiliacs, and it should be available regardless of whether negligence in the individual case can be proven or not. It should also be available regardless of whether the individual became infected with hepatitis C, although clearly anyone who became infected after the Consumer Protection Act 1987 came into force and who has obtained adequate damages under the Act, or who has settled adequately with the executive lawyers, should not also be entitled to further financial assistance. We recommend that this mechanism for providing financial and other support comes into operation with a period of 12 months. They say at paragraph 3 that the level of financial assistance awarded to any claimant should be determined on the basis of need, having regard to the physical or psychological loss individually suffered, and should include redress for practical difficulties, such as the inability to obtain an affordable mortgage or life assurance, and in determining an appropriate package of assistance, and in particular in clarifying what particular help can be offered, the executive should consult hepatitis C sufferers, both haemophiliac and non-haemophiliac.
I think it's practical help, not particular help.
Thank you, sir.
And then make a difference.
Yes. And then there are a number of other recommendations which I don't need to take you to. So after that rather long reading out from the report from me, what was your response to this report when you received it?
Well, I think there's several comments I could make. I think I'll home in on their reference to the narrowness of the view that they were presented, because there's actually quite a lot of overlap in terms of the concerns of the Scottish Executive and their own particular point of view. For example, in relation to negligence, they're saying they haven't found that there was any negligence, and in a sense they want to separate the issue of negligence from the issue of payment and assistance. Also, they're not particularly wanting to go around the route of a public inquiry, but they do want to provide assistance really on an ad hoc kind of basis, and they're accepting that they understand the concerns of the Scottish Executive about this being a precedent, so they're saying it's not a precedent, and they're also listening to the Scottish Executive concerns about this may create a risk-averse NHS, and they're saying, no, we don't want to change the nature of NHS decision-making. So there is a considerable overlap, but clearly the main flagship policy or recommendation is there has to be some payment and other assistance to these people. And the Scottish Executive, in responding to that, I suppose, is clinging to this idea, it would be a precedent and it would have enormous financial implications. But it's not just saying no to them, and that's where the decision to set up the expert group came in, because what the Scottish Executive's view at that time was, okay, if we're going to give assistance in situations like this, we're not happy just about this being on an ad hoc basis, and therefore it will be a precedent. We want to know what the principles are for making such awards, what criteria will be used, how will we have general standards and principles in accordance with which we can make awards. So that was the reason for setting up the expert group, and in that sense the executive was not slamming the door on what the committee was saying, but it was saying we do have these concerns about it being a precedent and it opening up a massive public expenditure in the future with parallel cases, and we do have concerns about a risk-averse NHS, but let's look at this further. And I know some will say that was a delaying tactic, but that was the way that the Scottish Executive was thinking at the time. And in a sense, a lot of that thinking was actually shared by the Health Committee, although it wanted to go obviously straight to the payment and assistance issues without the intervention of the expert group. The other thing to notice from the report is they're not specifying what level of financial payment that they want. In fact, I think at this stage they're thinking more in terms of ongoing monthly payments, as it were, rather than the lump sum payments that we ended up with. So that was basically where the Scottish Executive was at the time. And what I'm going to try and do all day today is try and explain as fully as I can what the thinking of my thinking and the Scottish Executive thinking was at that time. Clearly, it was a changing scenario. I mean, we'll come to this later, but there was a fundamental shift which took place in January 2003, but let's just take it stage by stage. And at that point, the Scottish Executive response was, yes, we want to give help and assistance, and we were giving assistance to those with hepatitis C more generally in various ways at that time. And obviously I picked up the issue later in relation to mortgages and insurance. But I suppose the fundamental element of the response of the Scottish Executive at that time was, let's, if we're going to have ad hoc payments, try to say, well, what are the principles, what are the criteria by which we shall decide whether it's appropriate to award these statements or not. Now, we'll come to the expert group later, and they in fact were unable to come up with such principles and criteria, and so they ended up with the ad hoc position as well. And if we look ahead to what the Scottish Executive decided in January 2003, we ultimately came to the same decision as well. But clearly there were a lot of different stages to go through between October 2001 and January 2003.
So let's then look at some of the documents to get more of an understanding of the decision making and thinking at the time. Can we go to your recommendation to Cabinet on the 30th of November 2001, which is at SCGV 40247_002. So we can see that it's on, if we go over to page 2, we can see it's got your name at the top with the date 30th of November. Is this right to understand it, that it's to the First Minister from you, copied into all of the people there?
Indeed, yes.
And then we see paragraph 1, the purpose is to seek agreement to the Scottish Executive's formal response to the recommendations made in the Health and Community Care Committee report on hepatitis C. And then you set out the background to it. And if we could go over to page 2, under discussion, and look in a little more detail about what's said there. If we see under the, if we could go down to the bottom half of the page, support for Hep C sufferers, And it says this: the committee claims that it supports the general principle of not paying compensation for harm caused by the NHS treatment simply because the treatment carried a risk, and so on. And then paragraph 11 sets out the committee's point on inconsistency that we've just looked at, and what they say that it would not necessarily require the NHS to change any of its current medical policies and practices on risk arising from treatment. And then you say this seems a flawed argument. The decision to compensate HIV sufferers was taken at a stage when the full implications were not apparent. In retrospect, it may not have been a wise move, and the Executive and UK Government have consistently argued that it was a special case. If Hep C sufferers are also compensated, then it will be very difficult to maintain the special case argument. And then you say this at paragraph 13: it now appears to be a fairly regular occurrence for new diseases to be identified, and for some of these diseases to have a long latency period. This has certainly been the case in the field of blood transfusion. There is no reason to believe that further such diseases will not emerge in the future. This means that by the time that the responsible agent has identified and preventative measures put in place, some people have suffered serious health impairment. We think it would be wrong to create an expectation that these people would automatically receive compensation for exposure to an unknown risk for which no preventative measures could be taken. We believe that adopting the committee's first recommendation would have that effect. And then you go on to say our proposed response to the committee therefore rejects these recommendations that propose financial and practical support for all people who have contracted hepatitis C. Instead, it offers up to set up an expert group to examine whether the general principle of offering such support is A, right, B, practicable, and if so, what universal criteria could be applied. So I want to ask you some questions about what you say, first of all, in paragraph 13. Was it your understanding at that time that hepatitis C in the 70s and 80s, during the time when people were being infected, was an unknown risk for which no preventative measures could be taken?
Can I just point out to begin with that this is me on my third day as Health Minister, this particular minute, and it might be interesting just to look at the minute of 21st November when Susan Deacon was the Minister. I'm just pointing that out because some people might think I'd chosen every word in this minute. I think you'll find the words on the 21st of November are more or less similar, although I do remember adding point 15 there about insurance and mortgages. So I just preface that because obviously this is me 3 days into the job. But your specific question, no, I think people did know obviously about non-A, non-B hepatitis in the 1970s and 1980s. The problem was, of course, that there wasn't any test for it, and a lot of the difficulties that arose were because of that. So I suppose in paragraph 13, it's as I pointed out a few minutes ago, this was a fundamental concern of the executive and indeed of the UK government at the time, was that this would become a precedent, and this could go on happening in many other similar situations, and that was the worry about the potential implications for public expenditure. So that's what's being referred to there in paragraph 13.
So is it right to understand from what you've just told us that really what's set out here about an unknown risk for which no preventative measures could be taken from your third day in office, this was not you expressing your view, but you accepting the line to take that's come through what the officials and Susan Deacon?
I didn't disagree with the executive line at that particular point, so I'm not trying to say that, but I'm just pointing out obviously that this was the accepted view at the time, but it didn't mean that we weren't aware of non-A, non-B hepatitis, the problem being that there was no test for it. Of course, then the other relevant factor that comes up in relation to discussion of a public inquiry is that there were varying opinions in the medical profession at the time about the seriousness of non-A, non-B hepatitis, and indeed majority opinion up to, I suppose, about the mid-80s was that it wasn't such a serious condition. Obviously, that can changed as people got increasing knowledge about it, but that was certainly quite commonly believed in the 70s and the early 80s.
And is it also right to understand that at the time that this memo to Cabinet is dated November 2001, that in terms of preventative measures, the department would have known about the judgment of Mr. Justice Burton that surrogate testing should have been introduced earlier than it was, that hepatitis C testing should have been introduced earlier than it was?
Well, I mean, obviously the issue of surrogate testing is a matter of controversy, and you've seen the opinions of the Health Committee on that, and it's obviously one of these issues where, again, medical opinion was divided and possibly still is divided. So that, you know, some of those issues were controversial, let's put it that way.
May I just ask that this is essentially an argument about precedent, isn't it? That is in the paper.
Yeah.
And the argument you inherited was that to pay in these circumstances would create a precedent. Now, precedent is treating something in like circumstances in a like manner, because you're saying that this is like that, therefore you should do the same, isn't it?
Yes, indeed, yes.
So did it ever strike you at the time that to compare a known risk with an unknown risk was comparing the unlike?
Well, that's absolutely true. But the problem was, and this is why we set up the expert group, that we wanted to have more guidance about the principles that would govern this, so that we could indeed be comparing like with like, and that was really our thinking in setting up the expert group.
Well, I follow that, but I'm just asking about the expression of view, and it may follow from your answer you didn't see, despite knowing that there was hepatitis non-A, non-B from the 1970s on, it was a known risk. You didn't think, nonetheless, that this was not actually setting up a proper principle saying, well, you can't therefore pay in this respect, because this is, you're dealing here in the paragraph with an unknown risk, and you were dealing with non-A, non-B with a known risk.
Well, it may be in that sense that the wording of that paragraph is not absolutely accurate, and I'm quite happy to admit that. As I say, I obviously didn't write those particular words,
No.
but I accept your point.
It was just a question of the logic, because there are two aspects which are taken as the basis for an unhealthy precedent. Council has dealt with one of them, which is the assertion no preventative measures could be taken. Leave that on one side. The unknown risk is plainly not entirely appropriate as a precedent where the risk is known. That was the only point that I was just exploring, but you didn't think of it at the time. I follow.
You could certainly follow the route of the Burton judgment, which was if the risk was known, and in fact the Burton judgment even says known to other people that weren't in the executive, it was known to science, generally known, then you have to pay, you're liable. So that obviously was a view that was around at that time, the Burton view, but obviously the Scottish executive was taking a different view about non-negligent harm. And it's actually quite interesting that the expert group under Lord Ross also disagreed with the Burton judgment in that sense, and didn't find that the Burton judgment answered the question of criteria for awarding in these kind of situations. So obviously we were aware of the Burton judgment, but we didn't think that in itself changed our view about how we should respond to non-negligent harm.
Thank you.
And we can see that your proposal to the Cabinet is to reject the recommendations made by the committee and go and get some more assistance from the expert group. And I'll come on to ask you some more questions about that in a moment. But I think in earlier evidence you suggested that at the time of receiving this report, you wanted to give help and assistance, but you were concerned, and I'm paraphrasing, about the principled basis upon which you could do that. Is it right to understand this note that certainly, as in at this time, the 20th of November, your first few days in the job, that thinking hadn't developed to that point quite yet? You were saying no to the recommendation for any assistance, and we'll get the expert group to look at whether, as a matter of principle, there should be such compensation, and if so, on what basis?
In terms of the financial assistance, obviously there were other areas of assistance which we were quite happy to advance, but it was a specific issue of what was called compensation, or became called an ex gratia payment. That was the area that we wanted to have the expert group look at. And of course, I remind people that the expert group, and again, I totally supported setting up an expert group, but obviously that had already been proposed by Susan Deacon, and I fully supported that.
And then I just wanted to pick up one more point from this document before going to look at what was announced, and that's at the following page, please, page 5. At the bottom of the page, under consultation, it says this: officials in England, Wales and Northern Ireland have been asked to comment on whether their administrations support rejection of recommendation 1, and on whether they were comfortable with the proposal to set up the expert group in response to recommendation 7. And then you set out what the response was. England and Wales have both expressed support. No specific response has been received from Northern Ireland, but officials indicated earlier that absence of a response should be taken to indicate support. Why were the other administrations being asked to comment on your support or rejection of a recommendation made by the Health and Community Care Committee?
Those two paragraphs as well were identical in the 21st of November Cabinet paper. So again, I'm just pointing that out. But that was what the officials did. I imagine, and this becomes part of the discussion, that we were more concerned about going out on our own on this issue perhaps than on some other issues. I'm not saying ultimately I was, because ultimately I did decide to go against what the UK government wanted on this. But at this time, it's fair to say that that was a consideration. It was not a consideration for the other issue that we mentioned earlier, free personal care. So, but that is a statement of fact. I think they'd already consulted those administrations days earlier, and that's just what happened. I'm not particularly here to justify it. I'm here to explain why it happened, and there obviously were concerns about the implications for other administrations about us going out on our own on this issue, although, as I again pointed out, at the pivotal moment in January 2003, we did go our own way on this, even although the UK government wasn't happy about it.
Did you understand there to be a UK-wide agreement that there should be no hepatitis C payment scheme?
No, I don't think there was any agreement. I think at this stage, the view of the Scottish Executive just happened to be very similar, if not the same, as the view of the UK government. It wasn't because we kind of decided what's our view going to be on this. I think it was the view of all governments up to this point, both UK and Scottish up to this point. So it wasn't a matter of having a meeting and deciding that was our policy. It was simply the way it was, that the generally accepted response to how we should deal with non-negligent fault in the health service.
So the inquiry has seen reference in documents to an understanding having developed that this question of hepatitis C payment scheme should be dealt with on a UK-wide basis. Is that something that you came across yourself, heard about?
Well, not in any formal sense, and certainly when I went against what the UK government wanted, nobody said to me, "Oh, you can't do this because we've got this agreement with the UK government." So we basically evolved policy so that ultimately, a year and a bit later, we did go against the UK government. At this point, we just happen to have the same policy as the UK government, but you have to, I mean, the whole discussion about this doesn't make sense if you don't see the evolution of the Scottish Executive's policy on this. And what I'm saying here on the 30th of November 2001 is clearly not what I'm saying on the 29th of January 2003, but we have to take it sequentially.
Can we then go on to the response that was of the Scottish Executive to that report, and that's SCGV 5044_012. And we can see response from Scottish Executive, some general points made, and then you deal with the recommendation about financial assistance. And if we can see at paragraphs 5 and 6 that you deal there with the precedent point we've just been looking at in the paper to the Cabinet. It appears to be a fairly regular occurrence for new diseases to be identified and for some of these diseases to have a long latency period. This has certainly been the case in the field of blood transfusion. There's no reason to believe that further such diseases will not emerge in the future. And then paragraph 6, we think it would be wrong to create an expectation in the future that these people would automatically receive compensation. It would create a precedent that would be a burden to the NHS and future administrations, and so on. And then you say at paragraph 7, the committee argues that it's simply seeking to correct an inconsistency in the operation of the narrow precedent created by the Macfarlane Trust. However, the decision to compensate HIV sufferers was taken at a stage when the full implications were not apparent, and the Executive UK Government has always maintained that this was a special case. If hepatitis C sufferers are also compensated, then it will be very difficult to maintain that special case. Just pausing there, did you think that HIV was a special case as compared to hepatitis C at that stage?
Well, obviously the HIV issue came up quite a lot, as we'll probably see in future committee meetings, but the view of the UK government and of the Scottish Executive was that it was certainly a different situation, because at the time people assumed people with HIV were going to die very soon, and I suppose that was commonly expressed as the difference, and that was the view of the UK government and the Scottish Executive at the time.
And then paragraph 8, we do fully accept that the people who are harmed should be compensated if the health service is at fault, fully and quickly. The issue here is whether the NHS should also provide compassionate financial support when people are harmed through no fault of the service. If there is a place for compassionate financial support in the future, then we feel that it would be essential for it to be judged against agreed and published criteria. These criteria would need to be transparent, equitable and universally applicable. We shall be looking very carefully at whether such an approach is sound in principle and whether it could be made to work in practice. And we shall be doing that in close collaboration with other UK colleagues. We explain this further in our response to recommendation 7. is it right to understand from this that you were not persuaded at that stage that as a matter of principle there was a place for compassionate financial support?
We were certainly keeping the door open, but we wanted to have criteria. The words of the paragraph talk about criteria that are transparent, equitable, and universally applicable. So that was the thinking behind the expert group. I suppose that we didn't just want to have ad hoc arrangements. Again, this is the thinking at this particular stage. We wanted to have a criteria so we could make these decisions on an equitable basis, I suppose. That was our thinking at the time.
And is it right to understand that your rejection of the recommendation being made by the Health and Community Care Committee as meaning the Scottish executive position at that stage was that that the case for compassionate financial support was not made out for those infected with hepatitis C from infected blood?
Well, as I say, the door was kept open, but we wanted to be doing it in a certain way. So we certainly weren't slamming the door on it. We were just saying we need to get this expert group to look at it further so that we can have a system where we know what the criteria are for awarding such financial support. That was the thinking at the time. I'm just trying to explain that as clearly as I can.
Why was it that you, having rejected the recommendation, and it seems from this anyway, having rejected the case for compassionate financial support, why did you want to keep the door open? Because we
weren't rejecting the case. We were just saying that we need to have a sound basis for doing it. That was our thinking at the time. As I said, a year and a bit down the track, we weren't taking the ad hoc approach. But at this stage, we thought, with hindsight, we can say perhaps we were exaggerating the extent to which this would be a precedent, but it was commonly believed at the time in the UK government, the Scottish government, and indeed elsewhere. So we thought, right, if we're going to change the principle of no compensation where there's no fault, we want to do this in accordance with some equitable system which has clear criteria. That was the thinking behind the expert group proposal. So it was not rejecting the idea of compassionate financial support. It was saying we want to do it in accordance with some clear framework based on equitable criteria.
Were there any political implications in the Scottish Executive rejecting the recommendation of the Health and Community Care Committee?
Well, not really, because in fact, the Health and Community Care Committee, while not overjoyed at the Scottish Executive's position, they were positive about establishing the expert group, and there was no opposition, as far as I'm aware, in the Scottish Parliament to the setting up of the expert group. So I think the committee felt that it carried the issue forward, not entirely in the way that they wanted, admittedly, but they were positive about the setting up of the expert group. And I had a very constructive meeting with them on the 30th of January 2002, where we discussed the remit of the expert group and the membership of the expert group. So I don't think it was really seen by the Health and Community Care Committee as an outright rejection of their proposal. It was a particular way of carrying it forward, which obviously some people could castigate as a delaying tactic, but I don't think, in fact, that was even the view of the Health and Community Care Committee. It was just a different way of carrying the issue forward.
So I'm conscious I've trespassed into the break. I wonder if we could break now.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now until 10 to 12. This is the first break in your evidence, Mr. Chisholm. What you must not do, because you're on oath, is to discuss the evidence you have given with anyone, whoever that anyone is, nor may you discuss any evidence which you think you may yet be asked about today with anyone, but you can talk about anything else you like.
Indeed, thank you. Thank you very much.
10 to 12.